Morning, this is the House Appropriations Committee. It is Wednesday, January 22nd, 2025, just after 9 a.m. And we have lots of things going on today. We'll have JFO talking to us about a little bit more orientation about budgeting and language and definitions. And then the Agency of Commerce and Community Development will be talking about their budget as it relates to budget adjustment. At 10 o'clock, we'll break for the emergency board, which is going to be held up in the governor's ceremonial office. You all can watch here. It's going to be live streamed on the JFO website. So anybody watching here can also watch there. And then after lunch, we have a bit of a break actually. So till 2 o'clock. And then we're going to have, we've invited Senate Appropriations Committee to join us here. And Tom Cavett, who is the legislative economist, is going to come talk about and really answer questions that we all have about what we heard at the e-board and the consensus revenue forecast, whether it's up or down, and it'll be not just the general fund, but the transportation fund and the education fund. So I'm sure lots of things to talk about. And then after that conversation, there will be at 3:45 p.m. a caucus of the whole in the chamber. So the House and the Senate will meet there. The governor will present his education proposal, public education. So we're really only meeting as a committee this morning, and then we have all these other activities going on. And then tomorrow we'll meet at 9 for a briefing that, because it's related to security, will not be live streamed. It's a private meeting for obvious reasons. So that's the day. But first we have Emily from the Joint Fiscal Office, and we have a handout that Aaron gave us, and then Emily, I think I'm going to turn it over to you now. Are you all ready?
Yes, I'm ready. And so for the record, Emily Byrne from the Joint Fiscal Office. I should say, realizing, right, that terms have multiple meanings, which is what we're going to sort of talk about in this presentation, that I've titled this presentation, Overview of State Budget Language. This is not actually an overview of the language that's going to be in the bill. This is sort of an overview of language that we use when we talk about the budget. So I may retitle this in the future.
Vocabulary.
Yes, and yeah, now that I'm like thinking more out loud, you're having a finance person doing an English lesson, so this is going to be good.
That's okay, because I have to turn numbers into prose. So.
Something for everybody.
Yeah. So we'll see how this goes. So, and I kept it, we're not going through, kept it to.
I like your first page.
Good.
You speak like an appropriator.
This is my land. Sorry.
Right, so at a high level, right, there's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around, like it's things that every normal person, terms that I assume everybody knows what a reversion is, right? But nobody knows, it's not a term that gets kicked around a lot. And, JFO will use it, folks in the administration will use this language. So just wanted to like level set, what does this language mean? I've only picked about 5 terms for today, so you're not trying to learn the whole lexicon. We can come back and do another 15 minutes on something else another day, but I know that Deputy Commissioner Hardy from Finance and Management will be in tomorrow to walk through the carry forward report. So I focused this one on carry forward, reversion, appropriation as a starting place. And as always, interrupt as I go along with questions. And we'll go from there. So how to speak like an appropriator, part 1. As I said, right, there are a lot of terms that get tossed around by the experts. They don't always have obvious definitions, and financial terms, like many technical terms, have very specific definitions. And if we use them incorrectly, then we are going to misspeak about what we're actually asking to happen, in the actual budget itself, or as we're trying to figure out how to balance the thing. So we're going to talk about terms that relate to appropriations themselves. So we're going to talk about what spending authority means, what the term appropriation means, sort of difference between an appropriation, an obligation, and an expense or an expenditure. Talk about carry forward and talk about reversions. Hopefully by the end of this, they'll make a little more sense.
No diversions.
No diversions, no. So the first two we'll talk about together is spending authority and appropriation. So spending authority is sort of effectively the legislature executing its power of the purse right? The General Assembly is authorizing, and I use it's sort of an entity of government, because it's not just agencies and departments in the executive branch. You're authorizing the General Assembly itself to spend money next fiscal year, and you're authorizing the judiciary as the third branch of government to spend money. So it's about spending a specific amount of money from a specific fund, so the general fund, federal funds, wherever, for a specific purpose. And again, it's granted to sort of all three branches of government and, within component units of those branches of government. And appropriation is really just that formal term for spending authority, right? So when you appropriate money, it's spending authority for a specific activity from a specific fund for a specific, that's redundant.
So this has confused me, and this is my 5th year on here. When we talk about spending authority, can you give spending authority without an appropriation ever? Or I'm wondering about, sometimes an agency will come in here and say, we need spending authority to do this.
Mhm.
The money's been appropriated, but we didn't get enough authority to spend it all, or something like that.
Sure. So sometimes maybe like a not enough is appropriated. They have more revenue than what is authorized. So they need an increase in the spending authority, or an increase in the appropriation. We'll talk a little bit about excess receipts, but we're not going to go into what excess receipts are today, because that's a whole other can of worms.
We should talk about it.
We should talk about those. Yeah.
So, but you need the appropriation first before you can have the spending authority.
They're the same thing.
They are the same.
Yeah.
So they get used interchangeably by the administration.
Yes.
And that's what throws me off.
Yes.
Representative
So
Harrison.
just, try to clarify. Obviously, we have many sources of funds, but let's just talk about special funds and then also general fund. So general fund, my assumption is we always have to appropriate. That no one has a free access to general funds. But special funds, let's say, for example, one of the areas of the BAA was the child care fund, special fund, right? The payroll tax goes into. And can the agency that's responsible for that fund, can they just spend whatever there? Or they still have to be appropriated out of that special fund?
Yes. Spending authority has to be granted. An appropriation has to be made from that special fund, from federal funds, right? There are other ways that an agency or department can get spending authority through sort of a delegation of authority that's happened by the General Assembly to the executive branch. And this is, now I'm thinking of part 2, right? It's sort of what are those areas of statute that have been delegated? So one example I'll give is for federal grants. So Joint Fiscal Committee has been authorized the ability to authorize spending from federal grants through the adoption of when an agency receives a federal grant and the General Assembly isn't in session, right? We want them to start work on that project. So they go to the Joint Fiscal Committee, and the Joint Fiscal Committee gets a projected budget for the life of that grant. And the Joint Fiscal Committee says, yes, go do the thing, right? Through that action that's been delegated to the Joint Fiscal Committee, that is providing spending authority or an appropriation to that agency or department only for that fiscal year for that specific set of federal funds. What usually then happens is in the next budget, you'll see, a line item in their ups and downs that says, new grant for whatever thing. And then that spending authority then becomes sort of part of their base budget, or will go into their budget process itself. But that's an example of a delegation of that appropriation authority in a very specific instance.
Okay, so we don't have any special funds where the respective agency can just spend from that.
No, they have to get spending authority. The other way they get spending authority is through the excess receipts process, which is another delegation to the Commissioner of Finance and Management from the General Assembly. It's in Title 32 that allows them to sort of review. I can bring some slides on this, but sort of review where, what's happened. If there's extra revenue that's generated, right? I got to think of a good example. More people buy fishing licenses, right? And they need to use that money to do something because they need to provide, demand goes up, supply goes up, demand goes up, whatever. through the excess receipts process, they can get access to that additional revenue in the current fiscal year.
But that process is.
So Lynn, Rep. Dickinson has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Can we go back to Jim's initial question?
Maybe,
I
yeah,
mean, you're getting into the weeds.
yeah.
I mean, I understand that, but
And I appreciate you pulling me back out of the.
yes, yes. You have your general fund. We obviously, that's what we appropriate. We give spending authority, and no one can do anything with the general fund until we decide that it can be done. Special funds are funds that have their own sources of revenue, not necessarily federal funds. Some have that. But if they want to spend money, what I heard originally is that, yes, we have to go and appropriate that money before they can spend it.
Correct,
And that's so they can't spend any more than we appropriate.
correct.
And then we'll get into all the other reversion, carry forward.
Yeah.
Receipts, blah, 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 all that
Yeah.
other stuff as you go on. But that's what I wanted to know is special funds
Yeah,
we have to appropriate it. General funds, we have to appropriate it. And that includes the ed fund and the transportation.
includes, yes, any state funds.
And the capital.
And the capital bill and the interdepartment authority to use the interdepartmental transfer fund, all
All of that that's
all of
why
it
it's all
has.
in the big bill.
Yes.
Okay.
So
And then we can get into what happens if they have excess money. My understanding is that special funds, for instance, often get swept out of the special fund and into general fund for a variety of reasons. I guess that's a reversion.
Depends.
That could be a reversion,
That is a direct application.
direct application. Okay,
Which we're not gonna get
that's
to
all right.
those
We'll get
today.
into that.
It's more complicated. Try to keep it at the principal level, and then we'll go with the black diamond, later. Okay. So we're on the green circle for skiing. All right, Mike, and then John, and then Wayne.
So I definitely understand General Assembly's spending authority. I think I probably understand executives. Judicial, what role do they have in spending authority in Civil 3?
So you have to grant them spending authority. So you you say to the judiciary, you can also have an appropriation to spend money. So nobody in government can spend any money in a new fiscal year unless the General Assembly has said you have authorization to spend money from the treasury for whatever thing.
That's why they're in our budget.
And that's why the legislature is also in the budget.
Right.
You have to authorize the legislature to pay themselves.
Right.
And us and everybody.
Us, yes. Please, yes.
So we can be more popular than we are.
Very good point. Interesting. John?
One-time spending, is that general fund or would that be a special fund?
It can be any fund.
Can be any fund.
Mhm. Yeah.
So an agency may have a particular project, it's one-time spending basically.
Yep.
There. We need to provide appropriation for that.
Yeah.
But it could be either one. I just had a general fund or.
Yeah, or a federal, you could get a one-time federal grant to do a very specific thing. That could be a one-time spending authority.
The tobacco fund, the opioid settlement fund, their recommendations, and they're usually one time each year from those special funds. And then we approve that.
Thank you.
It always sounds so simple at the beginning.
I know.
Devil's always in the details.
So I think since you're talking Fish and Wildlife gets two major federal monies each year that comes from excise taxes at the federal level. They might come in and, you got through the budget process with the governor's budget and you've got spending authority set. Money happen to come in at a higher rate and you have need for that money. First, you need to go to the governor's office or Secretary of Administration. And then if you get approval there, then to JFO to go through that whole process in order to get spending authority
Right.
to use money that can be used only for that. Can never be swept into the general fund. That's federal money. If it doesn't get spent, it gets reverted back to the federal government.
Right. And that's the way the special funds are too. You can't pull something from the cannabis fund and use it for a business loan or, whatever. I'm making that up, but I can't. Mike.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I am very
Good to
clear.
know now. But
Yes, I want to be very clear. So the legislature appropriates spending authority to, like, let's say the judicial branch. And they can use the spending authority we've granted them, but they never appropriate. So we're appropriating
You're appropriating.
the spending authority.
Right.
Yes.
It's too bad we have two words, because if we just use appropriations, it would be a lot easier.
Yeah.
For me, I don't know, but
No,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that helps. All right.
And yeah, in my mind, I think is like the appropriation process provides the authority. It's the authorization to do the
I
thing.
think that's a good way to look at it, because you don't get the authority without the appropriation, so. Okay, is the water clearing a little on this one? Okay, let's continue.
All right, I have an example. Maybe it's a good one, maybe it's not. So let's say I give Chris $5 to buy me a cup of coffee. I've given him the authority to spend a certain amount of money, a certain amount of funds for a specific purpose, right? So that's Chris's appropriation to go buy me coffee. Oh, I should disclaim, I meant to disclaim this. I never asked my staff to do things like buy me a cup of coffee. This is really an example.
But if they did, you wouldn't turn it down if they went to the trouble
I
of.
wouldn't turn it down if Chris offered for me to give him, so buy, that would be one thing, but I would never say, Chris, you gotta go buy the.
Right.
So this example will appear throughout, but I just wanted to disclaim that. So appropriated versus obligated. So the appropriations process, right, establishes that authority to spend, but it doesn't actually commit the funds to a specific expense, a specific grant, or a specific contract. So when the agency and the department come in and provide testimony, they're telling you sort of what their plan is, right? This is how we're going to, if you authorize this spending, this is what we plan to do with it. This is the budget that we're going to execute. If there are big deviations from that plan, that's where the budget adjustment process comes in. That's what we talked about last week, right? It's a plan. Sometimes the plan is wrong, or, you know, some things change. So when the entity, so when a department, the legislature, whoever, moves into sort of the execution phase of the budget, so July 1st through June 30 of that fiscal year, they begin to obligate the appropriated spending authority. So what does that mean? They execute a contract with a third party to provide a service. They enter a grant agreement with a school district to provide services to students. Payroll runs every 2 weeks. So every time the payroll hits, they obligate that, you know, that's an obligation to the employees of that agency or department. They have to buy pens or boats or whatever is needed for that agency or department to operate, right? So the spending authority just says, in the next 12 months, you are authorized to do what you need to do to execute your mission, your statutory authority to provide services to Vermonters. And, you know, you have the authority to spend money to do that and to execute accordingly, right? So when the obligation is when, yeah, you sort of commit the money to do a specific thing. So, and this is different from an expense or expenditure, and those two kind of are interchangeable. But through the appropriation and the obligation, while you're executing your budget, no actual money is changing hands, right? The appropriation just says like you can access the bank account, right? And then the obligation is the department saying we're gonna, you know, use these $7 to buy Emily a latte this time or whatever.
Big one.
The expense occurs once the payment is actually made. So once payroll runs and the money goes out to the state employees. Once that invoice is paid for the work that's performed by the contractor or the subrecipient of a grant, right? And there's a lot of, you know, process around contracts and grants that happen, you know, to make sure that we're protecting taxpayer dollars. When government says we want you to provide X, Y, and Z, you know, we want to make sure that they're actually providing X, Y, and Z before they get paid. So there's, you know, there's a gap in when the service is obligated, right? When we say you're going to do this thing, they do the thing, and then they get paid for doing the thing. A lot of times, or not a lot of times, but sometimes you hear expense kicked around in the appropriations process, and that can get a little complicated because just giving somebody spending authority doesn't inherently mean that an expense is actually going to occur, that money is actually going to leave the treasury and be provided to somebody for the provision of a service or.
And this is when we got the federal money. These are the three steps.
Yeah.
So the legislature appropriated. So we said out of the $1 billion, 250 million to clean water, 250 million to workforce and community, 250 million to, you know, whatever they all were, housing, et cetera. So we appropriated it. But then state government had to obligate it. And that's what had to be done by December 31st of 2024. And anything that wasn't under contract or grant had to be turned back into the federal government. And then we have till December 31st of 2026 to spend it. So the expense part is happening, well, some of it's already happened, but it has to be done by 2 years from that. So that's kind of the pathway with some real stuff that we did. Plus Emily's coffee.
Yes. And right, so when an agency or department or branch obligates the money, or when an expenditure occurs, it reduces the spending authority that's available for the department throughout that fiscal year. So if there is somebody has $1 million worth of spending authority, they execute $100,000 contract, right? That obligation, that contract, signing that contract creates a legal obligation with that entity. And that effectively, both sort of mechanically in the vision system and effectively says that money is now set aside for that contractual agreement. And it leaves them only with $900,000 to do the remaining amount of work. All right, back to the example of buying coffee. So I gave Chris the $5 to buy me a cup of coffee. When Chris fills the mug, he's obligated to pay for the coffee. And when Chris gives the money to the cashier, that's when the expense occurs, right? So where somebody's in the cafeteria chit-chatting but hasn't paid yet, right? They're obligated to pay for that thing in their hand, but they haven't actually paid for it yet. So that's
Sounds like a lot of red tape for a couple.
They're standing in line and everybody's gone out for coffee.
I never knew you could analyze the purchase of a cup of coffee so deeply.
We don't even get into flavor and size and all that.
Yes.
I got charged.
I think if you buy the small one, it's $1.59. I think.
If you bring your own mug, it's also less.
Oh, that might be cheaper, yeah. Anyway, so often an entity doesn't obligate or expend exactly what's been appropriated, right? We talked about, right, you build the budget 18 months before it's executed, and then you have a whole nother year to spend it, right? We talked about the budget, it's a plan, it's based on a set of assumptions. So when this happens, the entity will find itself hopefully with some spending authority that hasn't been obligated at the end of the fiscal year, right? Like possible you spend all of it, right? You can't go over it, right? That spending authority is your authorization. You can't go over, like with the general fund, that's it. So, but if you are under that amount, you may find yourself with authority that hasn't been obligated at the end of the fiscal year or expended at the end of the fiscal year. So, and what happens with that spending authority depends on the fund from which it is appropriated. So there is some spending authority that expires at the end of the fiscal year. If the spending authority is from a special fund, federal funds, interdepartmental transfers, internal service funds, and it's unutilized, the spending authority expires. Unless there's explicit language in the bill or in the budget, wherever, that says the spending authority carries forward into the next fiscal year. And this happens on Maria and I were talking about the CHIN's appropriation to judiciary, right, from the tobacco fund. I believe there's specific language that says, these appropriations carry forward until they've been fully expended.
Yes.
That doesn't happen very often, but it happened. There are times and places where that happens. I think with the coronavirus relief funds, the ARPA funds, that was we want those projects to keep going. You don't need to come back to the legislature to get them reauthorized. So that keeps going forward. And, sometimes you don't know the timing of when the actual expense will happen. Like a fiscal year is kind of an arbitrary point in time by which is when we sort of say, all right, we're going to end it here. This is where we're going to look at everything, right? And we'll only authorize for a certain period of time. But expenses, some things happen on June 30th or they happen on July 1, right? And that sort of date is a little arbitrary, but that's when we sort of draw the line in the sand in terms of when authority exists and how we report on things. So that spending authority ends. And so spending authority from these funds is either reestablished in the appropriations process in the next fiscal year. So a lot of times, right, we know what's going to come from a federal grant, so it just gets reappropriated year after year. It's reestablished in the law, so maybe in the Budget Adjustment Act, they come in and ask for additional spending authority, or it's reestablished through the excess receipt process, which is, as I was saying before, that sort of delegated authority The legislature has given to the Commissioner of Finance and Management, specifically related to special funds, federal funds, interdepartmental transfers, et cetera, that allows the Commissioner of Finance and Management to provide additional spending authority from these types of funds if the department can demonstrate that there is additional receipts into those funds and in a, allowable use that sort of aligns with what they.
And then Lynn.
So just thinking about it, so we're dealing with a situation where on occasion, someone deficit spends in a certain area. And that's where BAA comes in, budget adjustment comes in to reestablish that authority, budget authority to allow everything to balance out.
Or reset.
Yeah, what I'm hearing you just saying about excess receipts is that there's a tail. It takes you $100 to pay for something, you've only gotten bills for 90 of it. There's another one that's been done that you have to pay $10, but you've come to the end of the fiscal year, so you got to find a way to.
Yep, that could be it.
Yeah.
Yeah. In instance where you got. Yep.
So if we appropriate to a special fund with a certain amount of spending authority, the authority is not fully utilized, that expires at the end of the year. But the appropriation itself still sits in that special fund until we do something else with it.
The money does.
The money does.
The money
Yes.
doesn't go,
That's
yes,
right.
that doesn't go anywhere until we, revert or give more authority or do something else. Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
That's a good point.
Yes. And that, yeah, that's a great point, right? Like, and that's an important, this doesn't even get into receipts or revenue or anything like that, right? That's a different sort of set of terms, but the actual money that's sitting in those funds
So
is
it's
there.
the authority.
It's the authority, right? So there is some spending authority that can carry forward. So if the spending authority is from the general fund, the transportation fund, the TIB fund, transportation infrastructure bond fund, the education fund, I believe this is a new one that's been added with the technology modernization special fund.
4 years ago.
Yep, or the Clean Water Fund. Historically, the General Assembly has allowed the spending authority to carry forward at the end of the fiscal year, subject to approval of the Secretary of Administration. Now, if you've read all of the language 7 times already, you've probably noticed at the very end, there is proposed language in the governor's recommended budget adjustment that provides this authority to the Secretary of Administration. It's generally always in the budget adjustment.
Yes.
And it says, right, notwithstanding any other provision, the Secretary of Administration or the executive branch appropriations from these funds shall carry forward into the next fiscal year and designated for expenditure. I can know from my time in the executive branch, right? Come the end of June, when sort of all of the bills, when you sort of everything's been reconciled and you know what spending authority, you go to the Commissioner of Finance Management and the Secretary of Administration and kind of report back. And then conversations are had about what stays and what gets reverted through the budget adjustment process.
John.
Just real quick, what's the TIP fund?
The Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund. So if you have an and I should go back to this language at the end, there is also sister language that I didn't include, but it says that the any spending authority from, it's only the general fund when it comes to the judiciary and the legislative branch, because this language only speaks to the executive branch, but it says that notwithstanding any other provision of law, any general fund spending authority carries forward for the executive and the judicial, for the legislative and the judicial branches. But because we're separate branches of government, we don't have to ask the Secretary of Administration for.
Right, right. So this is standard annual language that we did.
Yeah. So a little bit more. So if the entity has unobligated or unexpended spending authority at the end of the fiscal year, it's brought into the next fiscal year. This sort of relates to the timing issue Representative Dickinson brought up, right? Like sometimes you just haven't gotten the invoice from a contractor yet, or the work needs to extend into the next fiscal year because it's a construction contract, for example. And, you know, the first 2 months of the building season are in one fiscal year and the remaining 4 months are in the next fiscal year. So you need to plan accordingly. A lot of times, carry forward funds are meant to meet anticipated needs. So you're going to have pay act obligations to the next fiscal year. So you may carry forward spending authority to help cover some of those pay act obligations, right? Like depending on the size of your agency, depending on what's going on with vacancies, depending on what happened with the healthcare rate, for example, depending on if the retirement rate changed, things are changing and you have to react to it. And I talked about sort of a project timeline that didn't align with the fiscal year perfectly. So we'll go back to the coffee example related to carry forward. I give Chris the $5 to buy me a cup of coffee. The cafeteria coffee costs $1.59. I'm pretty sure that's what I paid for the little one, but I tell Chris to keep the change and buy me a cup of coffee tomorrow. The funds haven't been obligated, right? And Chris is carrying the funds forward for a specific purpose and for a known future expense. The example is buying me the coffee tomorrow.
If we give him money, will he get us coffee too?
I know that goes into the like whole, I've never actually asked him to buy me coffee, right? I just closed that at the beginning. So
Carry forward.
that's carry forward. So reversions. So if the department has funds that aren't obligated or expended, and it's determined that the spending authority is not needed by the department, then the spending authority is reverted back to the general fund in the big bill or in the budget adjustment act. And sort of through the reversion process, the money that backed the original appropriation, right? So we have probably not the best way to think of it, but there's a big pile of money that's the general fund receipts in a given fiscal year. We've sort of parsed it out to everybody. And if you don't spend your little piece of the big pot, it goes back into the big pot of money to be redistributed again.
That's the 2.5 pages of reversions that we have,
Yes.
budget adjustment, and sometimes we don't, it's $3.52 or whatever, we don't care so much, but sometimes it's millions and we want to know more.
Yes. So we'll go back to the reversion example. I give Chris the $5 to buy me coffee. Costs $1.59. I tell Chris I want my change back. And now I have $3.41 that I can give to someone else to buy me coffee tomorrow. Maybe I ask Maria to do it tomorrow, or I can spend it on something else entirely, right? That's a reversion.
Right?
But if Chris spends his $3.41 on bubble gum, that's a diversion.
That's a diversion, yes. Chris doesn't have authority to spend
That's right.
the $3.40.
More than a diversion,
And
yes.
that's that would be illegal, I think. Yes. So that is, what do we do? Spending authority, appropriation, carry forward, reversion, expense, expenditure. That's all I've got for this morning.
This is just right for this morning, and we're gonna have Hardy and or Adam, but Hardy at least coming tomorrow. Is that right? Okay, to talk about it. So we'll see it in real life. So this is great timing. Thank you very much. I'm going to answer all of our questions, and I'll be talking to Chris soon, I'm sure. So great, thank you.
Yeah.
And we have the Agency of Commerce and Community Development is right here waiting. Thanks for your patience. And we're ready to have you start. I have to go upstairs to the e-board a little before 10. So if I leave, Rep Harrison will take over duties. And then once we're done, then we'll put the e-board on the screen. And we'll introduce ourselves because we have lots of new people this year.
Sounds great.
Dave.
Good morning. I'm Dave Iacoboni and I live in Morrisville and I represent the Lamoille, Washington district.
Thank you. Good morning and welcome. John, I live in Burke, represent the Essex Caledonia district.
Great. Mike Nigro, represent Bennington and Elm.
Tom Stevens from Waterbury, representing the Washington Chittenden District.
Good morning, Brett. Good to see you again. Jim Harrison, Chittenden, Mendon, Killington, and Pittsfield.
Hi, Brett. Robin Shy from Middlebury. And on the screen, who normally sits next to me, Tim.
Tiff Bloomley from Burlington.
And Trevor Squirrel is out this morning from Jericho and Underhill.
Wayne Rush from Highgate, Franklin, Berkshire, Richford.
Great. Morning. Mike Maluki, Wyndham 4 District, Putney Dumps. Great.
Lynn Dickinson, I represent St. Albans Town.
Morning. My name's Brett Long. I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic Development.
And I think I'm here to address two issues this morning. The first is the BAA request, and the other is an update on the BGAP or Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program. I have to say, it's great to be here with two screens. Normally, I'm in conference rooms that only have one screen and you can't tell what slide you're on.
We aim to please.
So let me address the budget adjustment. After the lesson you just got that I heard, this seems kind of rudimentary, but the issue is that we are the recipient of funds that I guess are probably an appropriation to the Cannabis Control Board, in which they provide us a portion of the fees that they receive, and we disperse in order to provide grants to cannabis people interested in cannabis business or pursuing a cannabis business that have a social equity issue. So the issue we're trying to address is that the original amount that we were receiving was being funded to the agency or funded to us at the agency level. So the administration group of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. But since the funds are actually managed and dispersed by the Department of Economic Development, we asked in BAA to have the funds addressed to DED rather than ACCD.
So we're transferring the authority, spending authority, from the administrative section of ACCD to the economic development section of ACCD.
That's right.
And that's in the language somewhere, is it not? Must be in the language.
Yeah, it is.
This is Mike, this is yours, right?
Yes.
Share that. So that have to be part of it.
You have the Department of.
I'm sorry, Cannabis Control Board.
Cannabis, you
Yeah.
got cannabis.
Yeah,
You got-
sorry.
Okay, that's right, okay.
Don't fight it.
I-
Sorry,
No, but I couldn't, I didn't know what.
this is somewhere in the language and I don't know if Maria has found it or.
I think it's section 15, the
Oh.
piece that I have copied here.
Okay. Not 15, because that's Stephen. Well, they're the 800, so it would be further out. It's not in the, I think it's just what would this be, a transfer, Emily?
It would be a down in 800 of
Right,
$500,000 and an increase of the 8 something.
802 or something. So it's not in the B section. Actually at all.
Look. It'll be on the.
Yeah, might be on the spreadsheet. But it should be in the language eventually too.
Oh, that.
It's spread.
Right,
Yes.
evening rise to
What
Aaron.
page?
644.
Before.
Oh, yes. So right in the center, section 60. So number 2, 500,000 is appropriated for the cannabis instead of from the Agency of Commerce and Community Development to the Department of Economic Development. That's the big language change.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Any questions on that one? Okay.
All set? Okay, so let me move on to the BGAP program.
One quick question. Have you been spending that money? It's the money going
I
out?
think this is actually, so we've been getting an annual appropriation and, yeah, if you know the answer.
Yes, please.
Okay. For the record, I'm Lindsay Curley, Secretary of the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. So this is sort of the second appropriation that the agency is, or I'm sorry. I'm going to use that loosely, that we have received.
Yeah.
the first one that came through in the prior biennium was appropriated to the Department of Economic Development, which is where it is being spent. The first tranche of money is just being finally spent down.
Okay.
So we're about to start spending this next appropriation, and that's when we realized that it was in admin. We've known it for a little bit. We've known, and in order to spend it, obviously there's a little flexibility. Emily could probably clarify better, but that we can transfer appropriations between agencies and departments up to a certain amount. I think it might be 50,000 is the limit.
So this is a little.
But yeah, so it's more. And so what we're trying to do is, because we know we're about to start dipping into that, we need to, keep it clean and move it over there. But to answer your specific question, we have not spent any of this 500,000.
Okay, so this is an example of something where there may be a carry forward if you don't spend the whole 500,000 between now and June 30th. If that gets approved, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay. And the other is the BGAP?
Yes. So I'll kind of start at ground zero. It's a little bit confusing, so I'll try to simplify it. But fundamentally, the BGAP, or Business Emergency Gap Assistance Program, was created to help businesses and nonprofits that suffered physical damage. Physical damage is an important part there, from flooding in either the 23 flooding events or the 24 flooding events. And the program includes assistance to farms and landlords. We'll get into the eligibility a little bit on the different programs. BGAP is funded per physical location. So if you think about somebody who owns several different apartment buildings, they could be eligible for assistance on the different buildings as their different physical locations. They do have to submit separate applications for each location. And along those lines, a particular entity can only receive awards for up to 3 individual locations. So there is that limit. Let's see. The other piece is that we have been provided the assistance of Central Vermont Economic Development Corporation, the RDC here in Montpelier, to provide technical assistance to applicants. And it's particularly relevant for the most recent flooding, since a lot of the damage happened in Washington County. There, we do have a full list of the awardees to date on our website. So a couple definitions. We're looking at net uncovered damage as the basis for calculating an award. And what that means is the physical damage that somebody has incurred, less any insurance proceeds or other grants, donations, et cetera, GoFundMe, all that kind of thing. And obviously the idea here is to either repair or replace damaged items. So eligibility, the property must be in Vermont. The physical damage can include real estate, leasehold improvements, inventory, machinery, equipment, and included in inventory there are crop losses with respect to farms. The applicant, as I kind of alluded to, must intend to reopen in the same location or to be relocating to a different location to reopen their business. Nonprofit organizations are essentially only eligible if they're not eligible for assistance from FEMA. And that's a general provision of the program. And the kind of the reason that some of the guidelines are worded the way they are is that if an entity is receiving FEMA assistance, we're generally not providing them assistance as well. The ineligible entities, municipalities, businesses or nonprofits that sustained only economic injury, meaning that they were closed and they lost revenues, for example.
For Harrison and then.
Yes.
Okay, so just if you could go back just 1 second. So you mentioned that to receive an award, you need to show that you intend to reopen. So let's just, and I'm sure this is happening, you have a restaurant, they intend to reopen, they apply and receive a grant, and then other circumstances change, they realize that they're now way overextended, and they decide they can't get the extra financing, whatever the case may be. Do you claw that back at that point?
Yes.
That must be fun. Okay, no, that helps.
Yeah, unfortunately, we do. And we're in the midst of that process now, especially from 23 flooding.
Is there a time period where they have to commit to reopening?
Fundamentally, what the awardees are required to submit progress reports, and then we go back and do monitoring on those where we're not getting sufficient documentation to justify the amount of the award. The philosophy was that let's award people the money so they can pay their bills. But if they, at the end of the day, if they can't substantiate that they used the funds to repair or reopen, then they'll be obligated to repay the difference.
Yes.
So a farm, a lot of times farms have crop insurance. So the crop insurance pays off first before you would.
Yeah, I don't want to claim to be the farm expert. We've actually worked in collaboration with Agency of Agriculture, who have their own set of reviewers who are actually looking at the agricultural applications. But philosophically, that's the way we've approached it, which is any insurance amounts that you receive or expect to receive would be deducted before calculating the award.
Yeah, Representative Stevens.
So just to make sure I'm reading this, just as an example, the 2023 new. If I'm just reading your chart correctly. The sum of reported net damages is my report in my application to you for assistance. Or, I'm sorry, is that the aggregate regardless, and I'm putting insurance? Am I minusing out the insurance? Because I'm looking at the estimated awards, which are far less than the 30% of net uncovered damages.
Yeah. So that is the gross amount of damage people have reported.
So my business suffered $1 million worth of damage.
Yep.
I'm certifying that I'm going to reopen. I need your help. Regardless of who else I'm receiving help from, I can receive just from this fund, I can just receive up to $50,000. Is that right? Or is it up to 30% of what I need?
It's 30% up to $50,000.
30% of the uncovered.
Uncovered. And
So if I had $1 million worth of damage from this fund, I can only receive $50,000, not $300,000.
That's right.
Okay, just want to get clear on what we're.
Yep. And we've reported the sum of reported net damage number to be able to give a indication of what we're seeing in terms of the damages that have occurred in an area. So the total damages. So, you know, if you're interested in what's happened with your constituency, you have some idea. Obviously, we're not getting applications from everybody, but some idea of the degree of damages as opposed to the net damages.
And again, commercial businesses, agriculture, and nonprofit organizations.
That's right.
Thank you.
Representative.
And in the denied just means they weren't eligible to begin with here, but canceled.
Cancel. We have a smattering of people who decide not to pursue it. And sometimes it turns out, for example, I can think of one example where the people's insurance proceeds were more than they expected.
So they put their application
Yeah.
in and discovered it was going to be covered for them up to that amount.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
Actually, there's another category of impacted businesses. It's kind of surprising, but we've had a fair number of people who applied and then in the middle of the process sold the property. So they decide, you know, I've had enough of this property, and they've sold it, and so the new person is no longer eligible.
Just one Representative Stevens, and then we're going to ask Brett to move along. We're going to try to watch the e-board at 10 o'clock on the all-important revenue forecast.
These are upfront grants and loans are not, based on invoice?
No, they're upfront grants. So this is a little bit of the confusing part, that we have had repeat disasters. So we've tacked all of this into one program, but you could look at it as different programs. So in BGAP 1.0, we were addressing the 23 flooding. And in that program, we had $20 million appropriated, but we also received the proceeds of the license plate sales and SOC sales, which were another roughly $436,000. So the average award, so we did 560 awards under that program. We're in the midst of doing the monitoring on those awards. And there's some statistics here, I guess, that you can see without getting into the detail, but it's 99% or so expended, and the average was about $36,000 in terms of an award. In BGAP, what we refer to as BGAP 2.0, we were appropriated $7 million for damage in 2024, but also an additional $5 million appropriation to address damage that from 2023 that had not yet been addressed yet. That makes sense so far? That's the complicated part. So we're currently in the midst of winding up or wrapping up that program. On the 2023 new slide, you can see that we have awarded about 41 applications, totaling about a little less than $1 million. This process continues. We do a lot of follow-up to make sure that even though we're getting estimates, that we actually get the estimates to support the amount of the award. So then moving on to 2024, the $7 million appropriation, we've awarded about 139 awards, totaling a little less than $4 million. The average award there is about $25,000. So in this program, you could receive up to $100,000, just for clarification of the earlier question. And there were provisos that 40% of the funds be set aside for agricultural businesses until November, and 10% were set aside for BIPOC applicants. In the BGAP 2023 supplemental, we also are charged with essentially topping up awards to 23 applicants that did not have all of their damage covered in the original BGAP 1.0. So the idea here is that any funds that remain in the pot after funding the 23 new damages will be paid pro rata to people who have submitted another or supplemental application. So we're just wrapping up the process of reviewing the applications, and sometime here in the next few weeks, we expect to be able to do the pro rata calculation and issue the awards for 23 supplemental damage. But right now,
If I could go back, I think you said it earlier, but unfortunately, some areas were hit twice with the floods.
yep,
So if you were a business, you had all the damages, you received an award in 23, and then you got hit again in 24. Is that a new award, or is
It's a new award.
Count the 50,000 you might have got the first year?
yes, it's a new award.
New award.
So yeah, we do have a number of people who had sustained damage in both events and have received awards.
Thank you.
We do have a slide in here outlining the agricultural statistics for the program. And one that addresses the number and awards received by BIPOC individuals. Any questions? It's about 10 o'clock.
Yeah. Got it. I'm still on the agriculture. The,
Any questions?
I'm sorry.
Not a question, but just, Brett, I'll be your, this is in my portfolio for the committee, so I'll be following up on all the things that DED does, so, and then Secretary Curley's thing, ACCD is in my portfolio, so.
Happy to do it. It involved a wide range of activities.
This BCAP money doesn't appear in the BAA, right? This is the only BAA thing that you're coming in on today was that universization.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Any further questions? Nice to see you on the screen. Any questions that you might have? Okay. Any last minute things you want to let us with, Brett?
No, I think one of the things that we're doing is, as we're doing these monitoring visits, is collecting information about outcomes. So probably see on our website and newsletter and hopefully other places, some reporting on the outcomes from this program. There are a lot of people who have received tremendous benefit and are very thankful.
So if I could go back to unrecovered damages. If a business got, say, a grant from a local organization or the Vermont Community Foundation, which did a lot of fundraising efforts, that would go towards covered damages, or is that totally separate?
No, it would be deducted in our calculation from their damages to calculate the uncovered. So it reduces the amount of the award.
Thank you. Great. I think we're good, and we are back at 2 o'clock, and we will adjourn this meeting, and shortly the emergency board will be meeting on the revenue forecast, which we will transition our live stream here if you want, or you can go upstairs and sort of peer over the members of the board and governor and economist.